It's no secret that Nick and Nate Diaz are willing to throw down outside of the cage if someone mean mugs them. But the number of times they've gotten into unsanctioned fights and outright brawls with other fighters may surprise you. Let's run you through the dozen times the Diaz brothers have gotten into it with other fighters, and keep in mind this doesn't include the dozens of street fights that the two have gotten into with random people. It all starts in November 2005 at the Ultimate Fighter 2 finale, headlined by Diego Sanchez and Nick Diaz. According to Diego, Nick had spent the weeks leading up to the event sending an endless stream of emails his way talking trash. On fight night, Nick barged into Diego's locker room and tried to get things going early. It was up to Diego's coach, Greg Jackson, to pull them apart, and Nick left. But not before taking off his shoe and throwing it at Diego. Nick proved that he's down for fights after the fight too. Just a few months later, in February of 2006, Nick lost a fight at UFC 57 to Joe Riggs via decision. The two ran into each other in the hallway of a Las Vegas hospital after being stitched up, and moments later it turned into a full-on brawl with Nick throwing the first punch and Joe hitting Nick with a bunch of knees, with Nate watching in the background. The fight got broken up by security, and fortunately the cops that showed up were fans of the UFC and asked for autographs instead of pressing charges. A year later, Nate Diaz gets his start in the UFC on The Ultimate Fighter Season 5, only to find himself in a confrontation with Carl Parisian, who was there to cheer on Nate's Team Pulver teammate, Manny Gambirian. Footage of the incident showed a worked-up Caro grabbing Nate by the neck and playfully slapping him, which quickly escalated into a near fight that the coaches had to separate. In June 2008, the Diaz brothers would get into their first full-fledged cage brawl at Elite XC's Return of the King event. Elite XC brought Nick into the cage to promote a rematch with their lightweight champion KJ Noons. But the whole thing turned ugly fast after Nate Diaz threw a middle finger at KJ's dad, who responded by lunging for the Diaz brothers. Security pushed Nick and Nate out of the cage before things got too crazy, and the two left the arena throwing middle fingers the whole way out. The next in-cage brawl at Strikeforce Nashville in April of 2010 would be even crazier. This time, the Diaz brothers were in a cage celebrating teammate Jake Shields' win when Jason Mayhem Miller interrupted Shields' post-fight interview to demand a rematch. Shoves led to punches and chaos as people jumped into the cage and security tried to regain control of the situation. Afterwards, Nick tried to explain what happened. But the bad blood between Diaz and Miller continued, with the two almost getting into a backstage fight at another Strikeforce event a few months later. The Strikeforce Brawl cost the promotion their broadcast TV deal with CBS. And it took another 5 years before the Diaz brothers would find themselves in the center of another incident at a World Series of Fighting event in August of 2015. Khabib Nurmagomedov and Nate Diaz had been going back and forth on Twitter for months, which led to a cage-side brawl between their entourages during the event. After being kicked out by security, they picked right up where they left off on the Planet Hollywood casino floor. The incident didn't knock the chip off Nate's shoulder. A few months later, in December of 2015, he got into it with UFC on Fox 17 opponent Michael Johnson, shoving him in the Fighter Hotel before UFC officials separated the two. Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor had a few physical altercations leading up to their first fight in March of 2016. McGregor was the one who set things off, punching Nate's fist during a fight week stare-down. Diaz got a bit of payback by flinching McGregor out at the official weigh-ins, and of course by knocking Conor silly and choking him out during their fight. It's not always the Diaz brothers starting the trouble. While on hand at UFC 199 in June of 2016 to announce McGregor-Diaz 2, Nate Diaz would end up getting attacked backstage by Clay Guida's brother, heavyweight MMA fighter Jason Guida. That started with Clay Guida talking smack and ended up with a dozen security guards pulling Jason off Nate. That's not the last of the Diaz-Guida feud. In May of 2018, at a Combate Americas event in Sacramento, Nate shoved Clay from behind into a metal guardrail, splitting his lip and setting off another cage-side brawl. And of course, the most famous of the Diaz brothers' brawls has to be the UFC 202 bottle throwing incident with Conor McGregor in August of 2016. Feeling disrespected by McGregor after the Irish superstar showed up to the press conference over half an hour late, Nate left the podium moments after Conor arrived and headed to the exit. McGregor began to taunt Diaz, which led to Diaz and his team throwing water bottles at the stage. McGregor returned fire with full cans of Monster Energy. In the end, their game of catch cost Conor $25,000 and Nate $15,000. Peanuts compared to the millions they made in their rematch. And now you're caught up on the Diaz brothers and their extensive history of outside the cage combat, at least until the next incident.